Star Wars The Clone Wars' unfinished Crystal Crisis arc, which we discussed in detail earlier this week, was a terrific set of episodes, even in their unfinished state. But one element of the story they told stood out in particular: how they dealt with the characters of Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and General Grievous. These three didn't just receive new appearances in the unfinished arc, their characters were perfected. In this video, we'll dive into how the arc depicts each of them and why they're the best versions of each character that the Clone Wars has given us.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Crystal Crisis arc was intended to be a homage to the original trilogy, using similar plot dynamics, similar dialogue, and similar characterization. But while they put the three main characters of the arc in an original trilogy story format, they preserved the natures of the three characters themselves, and improved upon how they were handled. Anakin became more of the brooding, cynical hothead that he was in Revenge of the Sith, Obi-Wan leaned into his role as a negotiator, and Grievous was finally made into the threatening antagonist that he is supposed to be. Let's deal with General Kenobi first. Obi-Wan received the smallest change in characterization of the three, mostly because he's been pretty close to Ewan McGregor's version of the character from the beginning. Crystal Crisis just leaned into this more, and it also showed a side of him that we hadn't really seen in the show before. Being human, Obi-Wan did have a bit of a grumpy side, but the Clone Wars never really put it on display. That did change here, however.
Cavalier. You're Cavalier all the time, and no one says anything about it.
I'm just better at it, that's all.
More importantly, Obi-Wan leaned into the role of the Negotiator in this arc. Obi-Wan's showed that side of him in the show before, but it's never been quite as present as it was in this arc. It came out in the first episode when he wanted to carefully preserve and study Amani slime and a functional Magna Guard, much to Anakin's chagrin. It came out in the second episode as he tried to barter with Endente and the Sugi. Perhaps best of all, it came out at the end of the arc, when the writers used him to make fun of the Geneva Convention.
Wait. Excuse me, but according to the Yavin Code, all prisoners are required to be blindfolded prior to execution.
Yavin Code?
The Yavin Code, as determined by the Yavin Convention.
Let me guess, citing the Yavin Code again?
Yes, I was. No one ever seems to remember it.
Well, that's because it's about 1,000 years old.
Well, the idea still rings true today.
That said, Obi-Wan's character improvements were primarily in the form of his relationship with Anakin, and it put the spotlight on their interactions with each other. It's probably the best part of the entire arc, because it shows quite clearly how much like brothers they had become by Revenge of the Sith. They're old friends who appreciate each other's company, who know each other better than they know themselves, and it shows in this arc more than it ever has before. Lots of it is just banter, which on its own is great. It's fun to watch Anakin tease Obi-Wan for losing his lightsaber, and Obi-Wan complain to Anakin about the Jedi Council. You really do get the feeling, watching these episodes, that Anakin and Obi-Wan are pretty much one entity by this point, understanding deeply how the other thinks and feels. This becomes particularly apparent in the second episode, when the two of them discuss Ahsoka's departure from the Jedi Order.
Your disappointment.
It's not the same.
It's precisely the same. You took me under your wing and practically raised me. I'm your Padawan, just like Ahsoka was mine. How well will you sleep knowing I failed you?
Not very well, I imagine. Luckily, that isn't true, and never will be.
That brings us to Anakin. Unlike with Obi-Wan, Anakin's depiction in the Clone Wars is generally considered to be at odds with how he was portrayed in the movies. We'd argue that isn't quite true, but that's another story. At any rate, this arc made Anakin a lot more like he was in Revenge of the Sith. His character hasn't really changed, per se, but he's become darker and more cynical. The war is clearly beginning to take its toll on him, as is Ahsoka's departure. Notably, Anakin is getting much more impatient in this arc. When Obi-Wan wants him to try and keep a Magna Guard he's fighting intact, he quickly tires of it and accidentally throws the droid into a fan. When captured by the Sugi, he repeatedly suggests to Obi-Wan that they should shake up the plan and attempt to escape, and goes on a sarcastic tangent about how dull the scenery is when Obi-Wan refuses. More concerningly, he repeatedly displays open distaste for the Jedi Council, especially Mace Windu. He is also much darker and somewhat more Vader-like in this arc, though not enough to concern Obi-Wan. When the Toydarian owner of a building they're investigating starts giving them trouble, Anakin threatens to kill him, spurred on by his memories of abuse at the hands of Watto. When one of his Sugi captors begins playing with his lightsaber, Anakin uses the Force to activate the weapon when the guard has it pointed at his eye. When they finally escape Sugi captivity and break into a weapons locker, he gleefully picks out a pair of blaster pistols and massacres the Sugi warriors attacking them. And then he uses the Force to butcher the last one with the lightsabers he stole from them. But while Anakin is dark and impatient, he isn't bitchy about it. It's clearly just fueled by frustration and the pressure of war, just as it was in Revenge of the Sith. The pressure inside him is beginning to build up, waiting to be released when he finally falls and becomes Darth Vader. This arc puts it on full display. Anakin is tired of the war, tired of the constant games with the Separatists. It's made him jaded to the point where it's beginning to weaken his faith in the Jedi Order. The Anakin we see in this arc is the very same Anakin from the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. He's just in the position to be able to display all of this more clearly. The character that saw the most improvement in this arc, however, was General Grievous. There's no two ways around the fact that previous Clone Wars episodes absolutely butchered his character, and while he had some good moments as well, his depiction in the show was nothing like the deadly, competent hunter he was cast as in the expanded universe. But this arc finally dealt with Grievous properly. In fact, the Grievous we get in the Crystal Crisis arc is less like previous Clone Wars takes on the character and more like the Grievous from Labyrinth of Evil, which was by far the best version of the character. Grievous has always been vicious in the Clone Wars. It's pretty much the defining trait of his character after all. But previously, it was more of an angry, exaggerated viciousness displayed through backstabs and overly dramatic displays of rage. Grievous's viciousness in this arc, like in the EU, was much more surgical in a sense. While his trademark open anger is still present, he's also developed a much colder attitude and he cuts right to the point.
Sorry, my lord.
No! Now you are sorry!
This, when combined with his increased competence, makes him a much more intimidating antagonist. The EU, to contrast prior Clone Wars episodes, had always cast Grievous as an incredibly competent strategist whose downfall stemmed primarily from his trust in the Sith. This is put on display perfectly in this arc. In Crystal Crisis, Grievous isn't an idiot and displays an aptitude for figuring out what the Jedi are going to do, as displayed when he quickly determines where they're headed after Obi-Wan escapes his cell. He isn't led on by lies and deals with incompetent subordinates harshly.
Thank you for meeting me here. The deal is right on schedule.
Where is the crystal?
Oh, the crystal. Oh, yes. Well, we had a minor security issue with their money, but the crystal is being delivered as we speak. It should be here momentarily.
Oh, really? And how will your soldiers get it here?
Now, we have secured the necessary transport.
They won't have a problem getting it back from the Jedi? Do you think I'm an idiot? My guards just reported back to me that the crystal is in possession of Skywalker and Kenobi.
No, wait! That's not possible!
If you don't have the crystal, then there's no reason to deal with you. Deal on! I will handle this myself.
The icing on the cake here is that the arc didn't just make Grievous colder and smarter, but it made him more skilled as well. When people critique the Clone Wars' version of Grievous, they often do so by comparing his mediocre lightsaber skills here with the incredible display he put on Hypori in the 2003 micro-series. But it's possible to make Grievous an intimidating fighter without going to the levels of over-the-top, show-offy curb stomping that the micro-series did, and this arc did exactly that. The rest of the EU established that Grievous was a deadly combatant not because he could twirl a bunch of lightsabers around in circles and butcher a bunch of Jedi while doing so, but rather because he was fast, he was strong, and he was good at analyzing the combat techniques of his opponents as he fought them. His brief battle with Obi-Wan Kenobi in this arc actually puts all three of those on display. When Obi-Wan starts by throwing boxes at him, Grievous just smashes right through, unfazed. Then, having fought Kenobi repeatedly and thus being familiar with his combat style, he speedily rips through his guard using a technique he knows Kenobi won't expect. In this manner, he disarms the great General Kenobi and has his lightsabers at his throat less than a minute after their battle began. So, that's how the unfinished Crystal Crisis arc perfected three of the Clone Wars' most important characters. But what do you think? Do you like these takes on Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Grievous? Let us know in the comment section below. And just before you go guys, make sure you check out all those links in the description below, including our Geetsly's Gaming Network, our main Geetsly's Discord server, and the Patreon if you want to help support the channel more than you already are by watching this video. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.